So welcome everyone. This is the last edition for the 24-21 deep dive into what the compliance paths that we have and that are available to us to utilize within the 21 and 24 IECC. Today, we will end with the commercial performance path. Now, I just have it listed as a performance path because we will talk very shortly about the differences between the two. As always, I encourage you all to ask your questions. I think it's great to ask your questions at the time that it pops in your head. So feel free to place it in the chat. I will say that if you put it in the chat compared to the Q&A, it's probably you have a better shot of me seeing it. Sometimes when it goes into the Q&A, it takes a while for it to pop up on my little screen here that says, hey, by the way, you have someone submitted there. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. And oops, there we go. So no matter which code you happen to be on or code that you're looking to be adopting here in the future, in the 2021 edition of the IECC, they title this compliance path as the total building performance. Now, up until this point in time, the commercial side has always called this particular compliance path, or I should say most of the time, called it the total building performance. Now, in the 2024, it had a name change, basically. And what it converted to was the simulated building performance path. Now, the funny thing is, in the 21, the residential counterpart of this particular compliance path changed its name from the simulated building performance to the total building performance. And then in the 24, everybody reverted back to the simulated building performance. So while this compliance path is apparently going through an identity crisis as of late, the concepts of it are still really the same. And we're going to walk through that with everyone. All right. Great thing. There was a new definition that was added to the code. And what it is defining exactly what this pathway is. So as you can see on the screen, it talks about it's a process for which the proposed building design is compared to a standard reference design in determining basically the estimated relative energy use against what a baseline would be. And that is going to determine whether or not this would be whether it's compliant with this particular compliance pathway. All right, so let's kind of dive into exactly what it is that this concept is. Now, what I have on the screen does say the total building performance, but remember, if we go into the 24, it would say the simulated building performance. And I believe what I did is I wrote it in black writing, and I didn't catch it until right now with the black box there, right? All right, so the idea behind this is really that you have the opportunity to kind of trade off the performance of the building as a whole. Last week, we did talk about how there is some thermal envelope trading if you utilize the building component performance option, which is that ComCheck component, but it only is associated with certain components of the thermal envelope. This pathway allows for an expanded opportunity to do more trading beyond what you would just find of the thermal envelope. So there are things like your internal gains, mass. Now that I want to tell you some mechanical components of it. So it's really taking a look at the building as a whole and how that building is potentially to perform compared if it was going to perform to whatever the reference design would be. So that's that twin building concept that you would have. Now, there are several tables that determine whether or not you get to trade off a component or whether it has to be the same, whether it's the reference design and so forth. Now, if you're on the 21, to be able to determine whether the project is compliant by the energy code, you would have to demonstrate the annual energy cost, and it's a variable for that. Now in the 2024, you get two options in how you want to demonstrate compliance with the 2024 energy code. You can either go with the annual energy cost, the one that has been utilized for all these years, or you can do your energy use intensity, often referred to as like an EUI. You've probably heard that term thrown around everywhere. That's our energy use intensity. And so in the 24, you do get the opportunity of utilizing either one. It's great if you happen to be in a jurisdiction that was already kind of requiring an EUI to it, or maybe you were looking at trying to incorporate EUI into the conversation. The 24 did bring that in there for everyone. All right. So when we start talking about how this works, we have the concept of what a reference design would be and then what our proposed design is. So they're identical, right? They have the same amount of square footage. They have the same design, the same outcrop, the whole 9 yards. Where the differences are is you have the values that they're required as part of your baseline. And you would find that out of table C 407.4.1, parentheses 1. So that's one of the things that you would be looking at now. And you also, in that design, would have to incorporate the requirements that you find out of C 407.2, which happens to be our mandatory table. And then for the 24, you have a couple of tables that you would have to pay attention to. And we're going to talk about that here shortly. And then for the proposed design, still the same, geometric twin. Now you're going to put the values in of what you wanted for the thermal envelope. You're going to put the values in for what you are proposing to install for your mechanical equipment, for your service water heat. What are you proposing to do for lighting, right? So those are the types of things that would go into the calculations. This isn't an in-depth one. This is just kind of like that 10,000 foot high of what the concepts are of this particular compliance class. So now we're going to dive into what exactly the sections are requiring out of the code. So the first thing is the mandatory section. So C407.2 states the mandatory requirements that you have to comply with table C407.2. Now, in the 21, remember that all throughout the code prior to the 21, there were sections that had a designation to it of being mandatory. And then all the subsections of that mandatory or of that section were considered mandatory also. Now, that changed in the 21. All of the notations of mandatory were removed. And the reason for that is basically what they were trying to say is everything within the code is mandatory if it applies to your project. Now, where that got a little tricky is if you were going with a different compliance path than what the prescriptive would be. And that would be obviously what we're talking about today. So you had to have a way to tie in those mandatory provisions that if you were going from 401 through 405 or 406 really, and going through that way, that you would, if you're going prescriptive, you're going to stumble upon that section anyway. But if you're only coming out of C407, how do you correlate that back to sections that we would find in like 402 or 403 or 404 or 405, right? And so how they did it is they created a table. In that table lists all the sections that had been considered mandatory in the past. And then in the 2024, there were new sections that were expanded upon, because it's always that kind of cat and mouse type of game that happens sometimes with that, because while the table was created, it was based off of everything that was considered mandatory in the 2018. You couldn't put in potentially future proposals that might get passed in the 2021 in that table, because you don't know whether that provision is going to pass or not. So things that passed in the 21 did get incorporated into the 24 edition of that table to try to really help with the navigation of it. So here are the mandatory provisions, the table that you would look at if you were on the 21 edition. And then here are the provisions that you would follow if you were on the 24 edition of this. So as you can see, in the 21, it just had air leakage and the thermal envelope. In the 24, it does have air leakage, but it also has things like insulation of radiant heating system panels, skylight curbs, ensuring that all the joints and seams are staggered for continuous insulation, and then our building thermal envelope certificate, components that are vital no matter what compliance path that's utilized. So there are items that came into the 21 and a couple of things that came into the 24 that did have that correlation with it. All right. So number 2 in the list, whether you're 21 or 24, 21 says that when everything is said and done, your proposed design, what you're wanting to do, has to demonstrate that it is at least, or I shouldn't say no more than 80% of what the annual energy cost is of that reference design. Basically, what it's trying to say is that you're 20% better than what the reference design is. Now, anybody have any idea why they said you had to be 20% better than what if you were going with the reference design is? Sorry if you hear all this noise, they're jackhammering and anyone? Okay. Well, let's think back to last week for those that were here. Remember last week in the prescriptive path, there's this thing called section C406, which is our additional efficiency requirements. But that only pertains to the prescriptive path. So to ensure that all of our compliance paths are as equal as basically as humanly possible that you can do that, the way that they were able to kind of offset that is requiring that you demonstrate that you're 20% better than what the base code would be, because they've equated that the additional efficiency requirements are about 15 to 20% better than just base code. Now, for the 2024, it goes into a little bit more detail as far as, how you're going to look at all that. So what it says is that your proposed design is equal to or less of the percentage of the annual energy cost of that reference design when you are utilizing equation 4-34. Now, it also, in that section, had a few additional items that pertain to that. You can utilize on-site renewable energy, doesn't have to be solar, but on-site renewable energy But you can only apply that to 5% of the cost. Now, this isn't exactly new. There is a section in the 21 that does talk about that, but they brought it over into here, which kind of makes sense. Now, this is where it gives you the option, instead of doing the annual energy cost, that you get to utilize your energy use intensity, your EUI. And then when you do that, there is a little bit more that's involved. You're going to end up using part or into the calculation table C407.2 parentheses 2. I'm going to show you what that looks like. It's not the full table there, but it does give you somewhat of an idea of what you would do. So it's a conversion factor for when you're converting the numbers, your energy source, whatever it is, and you're trying to go with the annual energy cost, but kind of converting it over into what your energy use intensity would be. So that's where, you know, the equation can come in. There's some other things that can come in with all of that. But when they start talking about the table, this is the table that they're referring to in converting for when you want to use that energy use intensity, the source energy, as opposed to the annual energy use. All right. Now, we're going to take a look at the table, the C407 4.1 parentheses 1. And this is the table that really kind of gives you the information about what needs to happen for your standard reference design, what you do for your proposed design, because sometimes it's going to say, hey, whatever you use in your proposed design has to be the same as your standard reference design, basically saying you can't trade that off. But if it has at the standard reference design all this information that you would find in the reference design, and then it says as proposed, that means you have that wheeling and dealing ability for it. So here is our table. This is just a very, very small portion of the table. It's a rather long table, and this is only one of the tables. But here's a more close-up view of the items that you see in here. Now, one of the things that I want to bring your attention here, just because we did do a lot of talking about it last week, is the thermal bridging. Now, thermal bridging is now, in the past, it's kind of been alluded to within the code itself, but now it's a lot more specific and gives criteria. And so remember we talked about the psi and chi factors. So now that table that dealt with the psi and chi is incorporated into this design. Now, once again, it's not necessarily anything that like designers even have to do the math for. The software is incorporating it now. But I did want to bring that to your attention. As you can see here, we now are accounting for thermal bridging basically for every compliance path. So it's not just ComCheck that's getting picked on, or the U factor that's getting picked on, or R value, right? Because R value still has to comply with 402.2.7. It's incorporated into all of the compliance paths. All right, so what are the type of things that we get to trade off? Now, if you'll look, these are the building components that you find within the 21 that you do get to do some trading with. So that, or I should say, they have components listed in the table. So your space use classification, everything that you see in pink there dealing with the thermal envelope, lighting is yellow. Our internal, that should say gains, not grains. Schedules, mechanical ventilation, heating, cooling systems, and our service water heating. Now, when we look at what we have for our 21, you'll notice that it takes up a lot more space than what it had been in the past. Now, what I would say is our thermal envelope hasn't really changed. Our lighting hasn't changed. Now, if you'll notice, the wolves that were in black, we had internal grains schedules. Now we have outdoor airflow that's being included. And before we just had heating, cooling, and service water heating, now it also incorporates energy recovery. Energy recovery actually has a big section out of the energy code. It's probably one of those areas that is maybe not thought about as much because we have all focused on the thermal envelope. We've focused on lighting. Mechanical seems to be that last hurdle we all need to jump over, which is okay because we got something coming up here shortly that's going to help you with all of that. But energy recovery does have a big impact, and there's a lot of ways that that could actually happen. Fan power, that's one in there, and then our on-site renewable energy too. So it's expanded the items that you really get to determine about how your building is going to perform. Now, if we go back to the table that we had talked about, now this one is out of the 21. For the most part, it's fairly comparable to what you're going to find with the 21. A couple of the tables are going to change because, as we had mentioned last week, in the past for the commercial, the R value was the first compliance path that was in the book, and then the U factor, C factor, F factor table was the alternative. That's flopped. So now it's the same as it is on the residential side, where the U factor, C factor, F factor is the primary compliance path, and then the R value is the alternative. So that gives you a little bit of maybe the major differences here, but I have here highlighted in yellow here that we're going to look at the middle column. This is our standard reference design. This is the column that is the baseline of what your design would be. And those values have to follow what is listed in here. So for this particular instance, for our let's go roof. It tells us that for our standard reference design, our insulation is going to be entirely above roof deck. Our gross area is the same as proposed. And then it tells us that we're going to go into table C402.1.2. Our U factors are going to be pulled from that table. Our solar reflectance, if we were in a climate zone that we had to worry about that, that's not here. Our admittance would be 0.9 here. That's for Colorado. That's the number that we would look at. So if we were to take a look at the roof, they would say for our standard reference design, when we looked at the report, it would say above roof deck, 1,000 square feet. R30, because that's what the table has listed for the climate zone that I pulled it for. Our U factor for that equates to a 0.032, and our admittance is going to be a 0.9. Now, it does have a solar reflectance of 0.25. So that's what our standard reference design roof would be. Now, if we looked at what it says in the far right column of the table, that's our proposed design. That gives us the information about what we are planning on doing. So in this particular instance, and we looked at the roof, for our standard reference design, it says type insulation entirely above roof deck. And then we come over to this last column and it says as proposed. So if your insulation was going to be entirely above roof deck, then you're kind of 1 for 1. But if your insulation entirely above roof deck and you're going to be doing an attic cavity insulation, that would change there. Your as proposed would be attic insulation. And then, of course, our gross area would be the same. Our U factor for the standard reference design is what's in the table. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, we're going to put in an R35 insulation, right? Something of that nature. And so this is where you get to start, trading off various components all throughout the building. And as long as it says as proposed there, you get to put in whatever value you would want to for that. Now, if we took a look at the values here, right? Our standard reference design by code, it has to be an R30 insulation entirely above roof deck with a U factor of a 0.032. And then what we're proposing is we only want to put in an R25. And so when we put in an R25, what our U factor ends up being is a 0.039. Now our admittance is 0.85, our solar reflectance is 0.20. All those values then, because they're a deficit of what the standard reference design is, so your roof is kind of at a negative, but maybe your walls or maybe your mechanical equipment is at a positive. And so throughout, you get to kind of, you're trading things off that go beyond what just the thermal envelope. A lot of times people just think I'm just trading within the thermal envelope and then I'm just trading within the mechanical. In this pathway, you have the ability to expand on what you're kind of quote unquote trading. All right. Now, in the 21, you get to, or I'm sorry, in the 24, you get to take a look at a few more tables. And that's because these are the tables that are actually referenced. Well, I don't have, if I had it pulled up, I should have pulled it in and pulled it over from the site, but it shows you that you would go to these tables. So this is HVAC system maps, right? It lets us know what kind of condenser cooling source, our heating system. Do we have single zone residential, single zone non-residential, all other? And then, so if you'll notice, it says here, system 5, system 10, system 11, system 4. What you then do is come over here and here's the system number that correlates with this table that would have the design reference that you would utilize here. So these two tables work with each other. Now, these two tables kind of work with each other a little bit too. We've got the number of chillers, how many chillers are getting utilized, the capacity for it. And then this one is your chiller types, is it screw, whatever, reciprocating, something of that nature that, kind of works together. So if we go back and we looked at the tables, and this is in the 21. I didn't bring over the heating on the commercial side, but on the commercial side within this table, like where it says here, equipment type as specified in table C40741 parentheses 2 parentheses 3, you would go into these tables and do that. It has the same concept in the 24. I just apparently forgot to add that to my slides. But in the 21, it's very, very similar. So the reference table says, hey, this is what you're going to do. This is what you're going to put in. They can't have a specified system, right? Because there's too many variables, especially when we're talking commercial, right? Are you doing a chiller or are you doing a heat pump or are you doing something else? So what it says is, hey, go look at these two tables, put that information into the reference design here. So we have the same situation where, depending on whether it's a single zone residential, single zone non-residential, or all other, and it has all these systems we would come down to number 3 that gives us this, what the system number is, the system type, and then the other various information. And those are the items that would get put into the software itself for that calculation. Now, because I've been talking about calculations, let's talk about some of the calculations that are out there. So in the 21, it provides information about very specific calculation software tools, specific approval, input values that have to be in, exceptional calculation methods. Now in the 24, they expanded upon that. You still have the calculation software tools. It goes a little bit more than just, and also the input values and exceptional calculation methods, but now it has software tool capabilities. And it's kind of interesting how that works out. Testing required by software vendors, and then the algorithms that are not tested, because they can go in the software and kind of reprogram it type of deal. And that's kind of where along the lines of what they're referring to there. So when all that is said and done, the information that's provided is we have to have a compliance report. Now, you'll recall that in the past, I talked about the residential side. The residential side has to have a report at the plan review submittal, and then also has to have one that's verified. At this point in the 21, the compliance paths report are only provided or only required to be provided at the plan review submittal. There isn't something in code specifically that says that you have to have it verified. Now, in that report, it does have to have the address of the building. We always have to know who this report is applicable to, right? An inspection checklist. Now, this, in my opinion, is incredibly important because what it shows is basically the information about what they proposed their design to be. So they're going to put in an R20 in the wall. Great. When you go out, you should see R20 on the wall on the plans. And when you go out, you should be able to see that an R20 was, placed in the wall. There are some kind of like tricks of the trades that happens with some of that, more on the residential side than what I've seen on the commercial side. But that checklist also has other things that they have to show. They have to tell us what values did they utilize for their standard reference design? What values did they put in there for their proposed design? And then they have to give you an annual energy cost, right? That's how we determine compliance. It also has to give us the name of the individual who completed the report. It doesn't have to be stamped. That has been something that's been talked about in the past, but it's not something that you have to have. Name and version of the compliance software tool. This is important because I've had people say, well, why would we care about what the software and the version of the software is? And think about this. How often is there a bug in the system, right? We've all had that, ooh, we got to update, we found an issue. Well, the same can be said, obviously, for the software. Maybe you knew that Open Studio version 6.1 had this bug in it. If you saw that, you'd be like, ooh, it said that no matter what you were doing, it always put in the walls as an R100, right? I don't know, just coming up with something. And so if you saw that, then you would know, ooh, okay, so you need to either provide me with, a different version because that, things get updated, whatever the case may be. Knowing the version can be an incredible useful tool in all of that. So those are the 4 things that have to be placed on the documents. The nice thing is the code also gives you the option. If you as a code fisher, you always have that right. in my opinion, because if you go into for the 21, because that's what we're talking about right now, you go into C103.2 of all the information that must be provided on the construction documents. In that charging section, it says the information that's provided for this project has to be clear to what's what the intent is, which we have that in all of our codes. So technically you could ask for any information that you need, but the code has these 6 items here listed as additional documentation that you could ask for. And so you could have ask for the building component characteristics for that standard reference design. If you had something like you were a little hesitant because that doesn't seem right, you could say, all right, now we know it. Thermal zoning, that could be really helpful. Input and output reports for the energy analysis simulation program. This is where it's going to give you things like your energy use tools, your energy source, end use served, total hours that were put into the calculation for space conditioning, any errors or warning messages that had been generated by the tool. So if something popped up, that you could ask for that and say, okay, I want you to comply with number 3 for the additional documentation. Give me all that information. An explanation of what the error and warning messages appearing in the simulated tool output. A certification signed by the builder providing the building components characteristics of the proposed design that were given in C40741 parentheses 1, and then documentation of the reduction in energy use associated with on-site renewable energy. So if they include that 5%, you can ask for, I want to see the documentation demonstrating what you included into the calculation for that on-site renewable energy. All right. Compliance reports when we're talking about for the 2021, as you see here, it is basically the same thing that I had been alluding to with the 21. We have the 4 that are required. You're also able to ask for additional documentation. And as you can see here, it has the 6 items that we talked about previously. Now, I think it's kind of important to look at a report and kind of walk through where you would find some of this information. This was a project that Group 14 provided for me that I can use. It's a blank one. It obviously doesn't have the specific, like here, it's at 123 XYZ. But as far as number 1 goes, where we would find that address typically a lot of times is located on that front page. Sometimes you'll find it in an appendix, but typically it's on the front page. It'll say something like the Civic Center Mountain Building Complex. And then it'll say, hey, this is a 3-story commercial building containing offices and manufacturing for mountain building. And then, it's located at 123 XYZ in Guacaloca, in Colorado. I don't know. And then it'll also tell you a little bit of, what code this was applied to, but we're just talking about the address. So that's typically where you would find it. Sometimes for various reports from other entities. Sometimes I have it as a cover page, so it'll be included in a cover page. You can accept that. Some people get concerned when it's a cover page and then there's a report that has no reference to the address within, that's on that cover page. So just remember that you do have the right to ask of the address in the report itself. So Our inspection checklist. So here is where they provide information about, the what went into the proposed design, the reference design, and information on this. This one is just talking about the mandatory. I should have probably grabbed the other sheet that was on there that talked about what the proposed was and what they were doing and where to find it. But this one is listing all the items that are considered to be mandatory. And that still is part of what would need to be provided. So here's an example of that. The name of the individual who is completing the report, what I'll say is that has been removed, but this is typically, where you might find that information. Another one is, here's another one. Here's what I was referring to about a cover page for it. This one says who it was prepared by down here. Obviously, we don't have the rest of the information. I took that out, but that's one way of finding out the information, or where you would find that information within a report itself. The name and version of the software. So we've got Open Studio 3.3 interface for Energy Plus 9.5. So there's some information about name and version. Now, the question I have for you is, with what you see on the screen, does this project comply? You guys were sitting there for a long time without me asking you questions. You thought you were going to get by this whole webinar without any questions being asked of you. How many of you say yes? Raise your hand if you say yes, this project complies. Okay. I'm going to lower hands. Okay. How many of you say no, this project doesn't comply? Okay. I'm going to lower hands. How many of you say that you're kind of like, I'm not too sure, partially because are we looking at this for 21? Or are we looking at this for 24? Ooh, Hope Now just said, ooh, ah. I threw a wrench in all of it. There we go. We got a few. All right. So let's think about this. If we went all the way back to the beginning there, it did, if we were going under the 21, it said that you had to demonstrate that you were at least 20% better than what the base of the code is. Now, if we looked at the report up here, it says that this project is predicting that it's going to be 21.2% better than code. So it gave us our annual energy cost for a 2021 standard reference design, was saying that our annual energy cost was going to be $180,150, or 150. Yeah, you got it. But the proposed design is indicating that it is only 141,996, with a little asterisk that says, hey, we included a 42 kilowatt rooftop PV system at 5%. Remember that, they have to notate that, and that's how they're notating it here. Now, what that does is now it moves us over to here that says our percentage of cost savings compared to what our standard reference design is. It's showing us that it's at 21.2. So we would call that good. We call that good, but hold on a moment. We call that good if we happen to be under the 2021. The 2021 Addition of the IECC does state you have to be, 80% of what that annual energy cost is, or 20% minimum better than what the annual energy costs. So if we come over here, we know that it's 21.2%. So we can say we are very happy with that. The other things to keep in mind, it's not just the annual energy cost, it also has to incorporate all of the mandatory requirements that we would find in table C407.2, which is this table here. And nobody gets sick. That's where this section of the report would come into play, because this is saying, hey, we have to have a continue, because you have to comply with your air leakage, which is in the 21 C402.5. So this is listing the sections in C402.5 and which sheet or specification that you would find that particular information to demonstrate that you're meeting the requirements that we have in this table. Now, the next component that you would have to take a look at is ensuring that the design incorporates the requirements that are listed within table C407.4.1. And so that's what you would find here. Now, you would then have to provide a report like what I showed you, that would have to be submitted at plan review so when they submit for permit, it's got to be there. It has to comply with all of the requirements for the software that you would find in C407.5. And then, of course, you have to deal with commissioning. It does say you're going to commission your equipment, which means if your mechanical, your heating and cooling meets certain BTUs, or your service water heating meets certain BTUs, you would have to have commissioning for your mechanical. If you happen to be where it is all your lighting controls, all of your lighting controls always have to be commissioned. So mechanical only if you meet specific criteria, lighting always. All right, now let's talk, excuse me. Let's talk a little bit about how the total building performance would look like within the 24. It is very similar, but not quite the same. One is your proposed design is equal to or less percentage of what the annual energy cost or reference design is when you are utilizing a very specific equation, sorry, that you would incorporate with that. When that is done, and if you happen to be including on-site energy for that, you are only permitted to include up to 5% in adding that to what your costs for your, if you were doing annual energy cost, or it would translate to as far as your energy use intensity. So it would count for that. Now, remember that in the 24, to determine compliance, you have two options about how you want to get there. You can either utilize where you're going to do the annual energy cost, the option that has kind of been dear and near to everybody's heart. We've used it forever and a day. Or what you're going to do is utilize the exception that does allow you to utilize that energy use intensity for it, with including, some additional math. So if you like math, this is the pathway for you. I'm just saying. The other thing is, when you start talking about, you still have to do the mandatory items. And as you saw, that table did get expanded a little bit because items that were done in the 21 were brought over, along with a couple of new concepts for the 24, because I will say the one thing that happened with the 24 is a couple of things. One is provisions that were new. There were a lot more definitions that were provided. So if something new was being brought into the code, in that code change proposal, it also included a definition for it, if it warranted, obviously. So there was a lot more definitions that in my opinion, that were added in the 24 than maybe in the past. And a few of those also included adding it to the mandatory table. So if the provision failed, then obviously we didn't get nothing. But if it did pass, then it all inputted into the correct location, which, is good for everyone. You're going to do the design per the table, the C407 41. The compliance report is still only required at the permit, and then you're going to follow the software requirements, and then you're also going to follow what the commissioning is, which we did talk about the various components for commissioning. I wanted to show you all really quick a couple of things that happened. I didn't put them in here because obviously when you have an hour to do this, sometimes it gets a little bit, you have to pick and choose what is going to be, best. Sorry about that. It kind of went a little crazy there. So now our software tools. Our software tools has some very specific criteria. And the nice thing is while you've always kind of had the power in the past, they wanted to ensure that code officials had the power by code to question or ask for more information from about the software that was getting utilized, because they heard a lot of people talking about the fact that they had some concerns about some of the reports that were being provided. They talked about that a lot on the residential side. It also was talked about, on the commercial side. So they were trying to ensure that they wanted to make sure that you as a code official could feel comfortable with one, asking for the information, or that they had something to kind of back up what they were utilizing. So as you can see, I talked about algorithms that were not that have not been tested. So it does provide some guidance about what you're going to do. It does tell you have to go back to a section that actually doesn't exist. But I feel like this was a good addition to helping kind of get that type of a compliance. So with that being said, I just want to see if anybody has any questions. All right, you guys always know how to get in touch with us if you have questions. Now, starting next week, we will do 3 4-hour trainings on just the 21. It'll be a deep dive into the 2024, the residential thermal envelope. And then it'll be a deep dive into the mechanical, electrical, and service water heating requirements. And then the last one will be diving into the additional efficiency requirements that we have. It's I don't want to say more complicated, but it's kind of more complicated because in the 21, it was just pick one and be done. And now you have to obtain a certain amount of points. And anyway, that was just a preview. Join us. And then after that, starting on July 1st, we will have our manual JDNS in the field class, and then we'll start a commercial version of this, which will be the 2024 commercial thermal envelope, mechanical. Then we'll hit electrical, and then the additional efficiency packages. And I saw a question pop up. Are you referring to for this series? We are in the process of getting it transferred to a new platform. This series is not necessarily part of it. It would have the Wednesday webinars that are up there. There may be a possibility that this will go up there, but it won't be for a little while, Brent. Sorry. But we will do our best to get all that up and going. It's obviously not live yet. Takes a while to get all that up and going. But other than that, glad you asked, Brent. All right. With that, just remember that you're going to have a survey that's going to pop up as soon as I close or you close out. The other thing is, if you have questions, one, you can always reach out to the helpline, or you can reach out to any of us. We are always here, happy to answer any questions you may have. And I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your Tuesday here. Thank you, everyone, for hanging out with me today. And I look forward to chatting with you guys in a few weeks.